If you had to choose between the person the world told you to marry and the person your heart wouldn't let go of, what would you do? This woman found out the hard way. Adeline Broussard came back after 14 years. She expected the town of Jeanneret, Louisiana, population 5,500, one traffic light, 3 churches, and a sugar mill that had been the heartbeat of the community since 1917, to have changed. But when she drove down Main Street in a truck loaded with medical supplies, building materials, and 3 months' worth of food, the town looked exactly as she had left it. Same storefronts, same live oaks, same bench outside Thibodeau's Hardware where the old men sat and solved the world's problems without fixing their own. And on the porch of the house at the end of Landry Lane, the house where Adeline's mother, Colette Broussard, had stood 14 years earlier and told her daughter to leave and never come back, a 72-year-old woman was sitting in a rocking chair, watching the truck approach, with a face that held equal parts shame and hunger. Because Hurricane Adeline, not the woman, the actual hurricane, a Category 3 storm that shared her name by coincidence or by God's sense of irony, had torn through Iberia Parish 3 weeks earlier, and the town that had mocked Adeline for marrying a crippled man was now drowning, and the crippled man's wife was the only person coming to help. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, please subscribe and like this video. We always love hearing where our viewers are from. Tell us in the comments. New York, Nairobi, maybe Kingston or Manchester? Say hello. Now listen, I'm going to tell you something that's going to make your blood boil. Because what this town did to this woman, the laughing, the whispering, the way they froze her out like she'd committed a crime, all of it was done because she chose to love a man who walked with crutches. That was her sin. She loved somebody the world said was less than, and the world punished her for it. So let me start at the beginning, because you need to feel the weight of what she walked away from before you can understand what she came back to carry. Adeline Broussard was born on June 6, 1984, in Jeanneret, Louisiana, a town in Iberia Parish, deep in Cajun country, where the roads are named after families, the food is seasoned with memory, and everyone knows everyone's business because everyone's business is the only entertainment available. She was the middle child of 3, older brother Marcel, younger sister Elise, and the daughter of Colette and Roland Broussard. Roland worked at the Jeanneret sugar mill, as his grandfather had. Colette ran the household with the intensity of a woman who believed that reputation was the only currency that mattered in a small town, and that a family's standing was determined by 3 things: who you married, how your yard looked, and whether your children knew to say "yes, ma'am" before they knew to say anything else. Adeline was 24 years old the year everything changed. She was 5'6", with dark auburn hair she wore to her shoulders, and wide brown eyes, and the sturdy, practical build of a woman who had spent summers hauling cane and winters canning vegetables. She had freckles across her nose, and a habit of rubbing the back of her neck when she was nervous, a gesture so consistent that anyone who knew Adeline could read her anxiety from 30 feet away by the position of her hand. She worked at Bergeron's grocery on Main Street, bagging, stocking, running the register on Saturdays, and she lived in her parents' house on Landry Lane because leaving Jeanneret was not something Broussard women did. Broussard women stayed. Broussard women married Jeanneret men. Broussard women had Jeanneret babies. Broussard women grew old in Jeanneret houses and were buried in Jeanneret cemeteries. And the radius of their lives was measured in blocks, not miles. Adeline met Joseph Tate at a crawfish boil in New Iberia, 15 minutes west, in April 2008. Joseph was 27. He was sitting at the end of a long table, alone, eating crawfish with one hand because his other hand was holding a crutch. He had 2 crutches, aluminum with worn rubber grips, leaned against the table beside him. Joseph had been born with cerebral palsy, a condition that affected his legs and his left arm, and that had given him, over 27 years, a specific relationship with the world. He moved through it more slowly, more carefully, and with more awareness of its surfaces than anyone around him, because every surface was either a support or a threat, and Joseph had learned to tell the difference before he could walk. He was handsome. Can you believe that needs to be said? It needs to be said because the first thing people saw, the first thing the town of Jeanneret would later see, was the crutches. Not Joseph's face, which was angular and warm and lit by a smile that arrived slowly and stayed long. Not his eyes, which were dark and steady, and which had the specific quality of a man who has spent his entire life being underestimated and has used the underestimation as fuel.
Not his hands. Well, his hand, the right one, which was strong from 27 years of gripping and lifting and compensating. People saw the crutches. People measured the man by the metal, and the measurement was wrong. But what happened next changed everything. Adeline didn't see the crutches first. She saw the plate. Joseph had an engineering approach to eating crawfish. He had developed a system, one-handed, where he cracked the tail with his thumb and index finger against the edge of the table, peeled the shell with a twist, and extracted the meat in a single motion that was faster than most two-handed eaters managed. Adeline was standing in the food line and she watched him do it. Not staring, not pitying, but watching the way a person watches someone do something skillful. She walked over. She said, "That's the fastest peel I've ever seen." Joseph looked up. He said, 27 years of practice. Adeline sat down across from him, not beside him, across, face to face, the position of someone who wants to be looked at, not someone who wants to look at someone from the side. They talked for 2 hours. Joseph was from Bro Bridge, 30 minutes north. He worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Lafayette. He had a degree in accounting from the University of Louisiana, the first person in his family to graduate from college, a fact he mentioned without pride because pride, in Joseph's experience, was a luxury afforded to people whose bodies didn't require daily negotiation with gravity. He lived alone. He cooked for himself. He drove a modified car with hand controls. He had been independent since he was 19, not because his family didn't offer help, but because Joseph had decided at a young age that independence was the only answer to a world that assumed dependence was his destiny. Adeline gave him her phone number. He called the next day. They talked for 40 minutes. He called again and again. Within 3 months, Adeline was driving to Bro Bridge every weekend, and within 6 months, she was in love in the way that adults are in love when the love arrives without performance. Quietly, structurally, built on phone calls and shared meals and the specific intimacy of watching someone navigate a world that wasn't designed for them, and admiring the navigation rather than pitying the navigator. Adeline told Colette about Joseph in October 2008. She told her at the kitchen table on Landry Lane, where every important announcement in Broussard family history had been delivered. Births, deaths, engagements, failures. She said, "Mama, I'm seeing somebody. His name is Joseph Tate. He's from Bro Bridge. He's an accountant. And he has cerebral palsy." The kitchen went silent. Not the productive silence of a person thinking, the loaded silence of a woman recalculating. Colette said, "What do you mean, cerebral palsy?" "He uses crutches, Mama. He walks with crutches." Colette's face arranged itself into the expression Adeline would later recognize as the expression that preceded every terrible thing her mother would say over the next 2 years. A tightening of the lips, a slight narrowing of the eyes, the face of a woman who is about to speak from the part of herself that values appearance over everything. Colette said, "Adeline Marie Broussard, you cannot be serious." "I'm serious." "A crippled man?" "Don't use that word, Mama." "What word should I use? He can't walk." "He can walk. He walks differently." "He walks with metal sticks. That's not walking, that's surviving." Colette pressed her hands flat on the table, the gesture she used when she was delivering a verdict. "What kind of life are you going to have? What kind of children? What will people say?" And there it was. What will people say? The 4 words that governed Colette Broussard's universe. Not, is he kind? Not, does he make you happy? Not, do you love him? What will people say? The question of a woman who had built her identity on the porch of a house on Landry Lane, where the neighbors could see and the town could judge, and reputation was the only roof that mattered. Adeline said, "He makes me happy, Mama." Colette said, "Happy doesn't keep a house."
Now here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Adeline married Joseph Tate on March 14, 2009, at a courthouse in Lafayette. Not in Jeanerette, not at the church, not with Colette and Roland in attendance. They married alone. Adeline in a white sundress she bought at a thrift store in Scott. Joseph in a blue button-down that he ironed one-handed with the same efficiency he brought to everything. The judge asked if they had witnesses. Joseph's cousin, a woman named Teresa, stood up. That was it. One witness. One judge. Two people who loved each other in a room that didn't care what the town of Jeanerette thought. Colette found out 2 days later. She called Adeline. The call lasted 4 minutes. Colette said 3 sentences. You married that man. You have shamed this family. Don't come back to this house. Then she hung up. Roland called an hour later. He was softer. Roland was always softer, the quiet counterweight to Colette's rigidity. He said, Addie, your mama's upset. Give her time. Adeline said, Time for what, Daddy? To accept that I married someone she thinks is broken? Roland was quiet. He didn't defend Colette. He didn't defend Adeline. He occupied the neutral space that gentlemen occupy in families run by forceful women. The space that looks like peace, but is actually paralysis. The town followed Colette's lead. Jeanerette was small enough that Colette's opinion functioned as weather. When she said something, the temperature changed. She told the women at church that Adeline had married poorly. She told the neighbors that Adeline had thrown herself away.
She told Marcel, Adeline's brother, that Adeline should be ashamed, and Marcel, who was 30 and still ate Sunday dinner at his mother's table because Marcel had never developed an opinion that Colette hadn't planted, repeated it. Only Elise, the younger sister, called Adeline to say congratulations. Elise was 21 and still afraid of Colette, but had the seed of something independent growing in her that would take another decade to bloom. She called from the parking lot of the Dollar General so Colette wouldn't hear. She said, I'm happy for you, Addie. Adeline said, Thank you, baby. Don't let Mama hear you say that. But Adeline had no idea what was coming. Adeline and Joseph left. Not just Jeanerette, Louisiana. They moved to Lake Charles, 3 hours west, where Joseph's accounting firm had an office, and where nobody knew the Broussards, and nobody cared about crutches, and nobody's mother sat on a porch telling the town what to think. They rented a small house on Ryan Street, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window that faced a vacant lot that Joseph said had potential, and that Adeline saw as a patch of dirt. The rent was $650 a month. Joseph made $38,000. Adeline got a job at a home health agency, not as a nurse, as an aide, making $11 an hour, bathing elderly patients, feeding them, helping them from bed to chair and chair to bed. The work was hard. It was also familiar. Adeline had been watching her mother take care of people her entire life. The difference was that Adeline's care came without conditions. You didn't have to maintain a reputation to receive it. You just had to need it. And that was only the beginning. Joseph was not the man Jeanerette assumed he was. Joseph was a force. Not a loud force, a structural one. The kind of force that operates at the foundation level, invisible from the street but responsible for everything standing above it. He did the books for his firm. He did them perfectly. He did them so perfectly that his boss, a CPA named Martin Thibodeau, no relation to Jeanerette's hardware store, began sending Joseph the firm's most complex clients because Joseph's brain processed numbers the way his body processed stairs. Carefully, precisely, finding the most efficient path through a system that wasn't designed for him. In 2011, Martin offered Joseph a partnership. Joseph declined. He said, I want to build my own. Martin said, Build your own what? Joseph said, My own firm, my own building, my own everything. Martin looked at this man, 29, on crutches, with one functional hand and a degree from UL, and a brain that could unravel a tax code the way other men unravel fishing line, and he said, I believe you. Joseph opened Tate Financial Services in January 2012. His office was the spare bedroom of the Ryan Street house. His first client was Martin Thibodeau, who fired himself from his own firm and brought his personal accounts to Joseph as a gesture of faith that cost him nothing and meant everything. His second client was Mrs. Guidry, their 74-year-old neighbor who needed someone to prepare her taxes and who had never used a computer and who sat in Joseph's spare bedroom office in a rocking chair she brought from her own house because Joseph's desk chair didn't rock and Mrs. Guidry didn't do business without rocking. The business grew. It grew because Joseph was exceptional and because Adeline, who had learned more about people from bagging groceries at Bergeron's and bathing patients at the home health agency than most MBA programs teach, handled the clients while Joseph handled the numbers. She answered the phone. She scheduled appointments. She remembered names, birthdays, grandchildren's names, favorite football teams. She made coffee for every client who walked in, and she kept a tin of peppermints on the front desk. Wait, not peppermints, pralines. Small pralines from a recipe her grandmother had taught her. Pecan and brown sugar and butter, wrapped in wax paper, offered to everyone who entered. The pralines became the firm's signature. Clients talked about them. Clients came back for them. Clients referred their friends and said, "Go see Joseph Tate. His wife makes pralines that will make you cry." By 2015, Tate Financial had 43 clients and revenue of $320,000. By 2018, it had 112 clients and revenue of $890,000. By 2022, it had become the largest independent accounting firm in Calcasieu Parish, with 7 employees, a proper office on Broad Street, and a client list that included 3 of the largest businesses in Lake Charles. Joseph managed the firm from behind a desk he had designed himself, lower than standard, with a keyboard tray that accommodated his left arm and a monitor mounted at an angle that reduced the neck strain from 12 hours of staring at spreadsheets. He had designed the desk because no desk on the market fit his body, and Joseph did not believe in adjusting himself to fit the world. He believed in adjusting the world to fit himself. That distinction, the difference between accommodation and adaptation, was the philosophy that built the firm, the marriage, and the life that the town of Jeanneret had predicted would be impossible. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you. Adeline had 2 children, a son, Elijah, born in 2013, and a daughter, Grace, born in 2016. Both had Joseph's eyes. Neither had cerebral palsy. They'd been tested, the genetic counselor had explained the odds, and the odds had landed in the clear. But Adeline would have loved them regardless, and she said so, out loud, to the genetic counselor in front of Joseph, because she wanted Joseph to hear it, and because she wanted the counselor to know that the test was for information, not for permission. Elijah was 11 in the year this story reaches its peak. He was tall for his age, quiet, observant, the kind of boy who watched his father navigate the world and filed the data away for future use. He had started helping Joseph at the office on Saturday mornings, filing papers, sorting mail, learning the language of numbers that Joseph spoke fluently. Elijah asked Joseph once, "Daddy, do the crutches hurt?" Joseph said, "Not anymore. They're part of me. Like your glasses." Elijah wore glasses, thick ones, for a vision correction that made him self-conscious, until Joseph said that. And then the glasses became something else, something shared, something that connected father and son across the bridge of bodies that required assistance. Grace was 8. She was the loud one. She talked to everyone. She had inherited Adeline's freckles and Joseph's smile, and neither of their reservations, and she moved through the world with the confidence of a child who had never been told she didn't belong. That confidence was Adeline's greatest achievement, greater than the firm, greater than the house they eventually bought on Kirkman Street, greater than any number on a tax return. She had raised a daughter who didn't know what it felt like to be mocked for loving someone. But what Adeline was about to discover would change everything. In September 2023, Hurricane Adeline, a Category 3 storm with sustained winds of 120 miles per hour, formed in the Gulf of Mexico and tracked northwest toward the Louisiana coast. The storm made landfall on September 17th near Intracoastal City, 60 miles south of Jeanerette. It crossed Iberia Parish with the full force of a major hurricane, dumping 14 inches of rain in 18 hours and driving a storm surge that flooded the lower-lying areas of Jeanerette to depths of 4 to 6 feet. The sugar mill was damaged. Main Street was flooded. 43 homes were destroyed. 207 were damaged. The town, population 5,500, 1 traffic light, 3 churches, was crippled. Lake Charles, 3 hours west, was spared. The storm tracked east, and the western parishes received nothing worse than heavy rain and moderate wind. Joseph and Adeline's house on Kirkman Street lost a few shingles. The office on Broad Street was untouched. The pralines on the front desk were undisturbed. Adeline watched the news coverage of Jeanerette from her living room. She saw the footage. Main Street underwater, Thibodeau's hardware flooded to the counter, the sugar mill's chimney cracked. She saw the bench where the old men sat, submerged to the armrests. She saw the church where Colette had told the women that Adeline had married poorly, its basement flooded, its hymnals ruined. She saw Landry Lane. She saw the porch. She saw the rocking chair tilted sideways in 2 feet of water. She turned to Joseph. Joseph was sitting in his chair, the one adjusted to his body, the one that held him the way the world should have held him and mostly didn't. He looked at the screen. He looked at the town that had mocked his wife for marrying him. He said, "What do you want to do?" Adeline said, "I want to help them." Joseph said, "They don't deserve it." "I know." "Your mother told you not to come back." "I know. She called me a cripple." "I know, Joseph." Joseph looked at his wife, this woman who had chosen him at a crawfish boil, who had married him at a courthouse with 1 witness, who had bagged groceries and bathed patients and wrapped pralines and raised 2 children and built a business beside a man the world measured by his crutches. He said, "Then let's go." Now, Adeline didn't just show up with good intentions. She showed up with a truck. She and Joseph organized a relief effort through the firm, calling clients, calling vendors, calling the network of people they had built over 14 years in Lake Charles. Within a week, they had assembled a convoy. 3 trucks loaded with bottled water, canned food, generators, tarps, cleaning supplies, first aid kits, and building materials. Joseph's employees volunteered. Martin Thibodeau, the CPA, the first client, the man who had believed in Joseph 12 years earlier, drove one of the trucks himself. Adeline's colleague from the home health agency sent medical supplies. The praline recipe was pressed into service. Adeline and Grace baked 400 pralines in 2 days, wrapped them in wax paper, packed them in boxes, because Adeline knew that people who have lost everything need sugar and butter and the small kindness of something sweet more than they need another case of bottled water. The convoy arrived in Jeanerette on October 8, 2023, 3 weeks after the hurricane. Adeline drove the lead truck. Joseph sat beside her. Elijah and Grace were in the back seat. The town was wrecked. Not destroyed. Wrecked. The difference between destruction and wreckage is that wreckage still has the shape of what it was. You could see Main Street. You could see the stores. You could see the houses. But everything was shifted. Walls leaning, porches detached, the smell of mold and standing water, and the particular organic stench of a place that has been wet for 3 weeks and is beginning to rot from the inside. Adeline drove down Landry Lane. She parked in front of her mother's house. Colette was on the porch. She was 72 years old. She was thin, thinner than Adeline remembered, the thinness of a woman who has been eating canned food for 3 weeks because the grocery store was flooded and the roads were impassable, and FEMA was a phone number that went to hold music. Colette's house was standing, but damaged. The lower floor had taken 2 feet of water. The rocking chair was back on the porch, dried out, tilted because one runner had warped. Colette sat in it anyway. Adeline got out of the truck. Joseph stayed in the cab, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that this moment belonged to Adeline and her mother, and inserting himself would change the shape of it. Elijah and Grace stayed in the back seat. Grace pressed her face against the window. Adeline walked to the porch. She stood at the bottom of the same steps she had walked down 14 years earlier when Colette told her to leave. She looked at her mother. Colette looked at her daughter. Neither woman spoke for 10 seconds. The silence held 14 years of missed Christmases and unattended birthdays and phone calls that were never made and grandchildren who were never held. Colette said, "You came." Adeline said, "Of course I came." Colette's chin trembled. Her lips pressed together. The same expression, the same tightening, but different now, because the tightening was no longer holding in judgment. It was holding in something she had never allowed the town to see. Regret. "I told you not to come back," Colette said. "I know, Mama. I told them you married poorly. I know. And you came anyway. Because that's what family does, even when family doesn't deserve it." Colette looked past Adeline to the truck. She saw Joseph in the cab. She saw the crutches leaned against the dashboard. She saw a man she had called Crippled sitting in the passenger seat of a truck loaded with supplies for the town that had laughed at him. She saw the 2 children in the back seat. Her grandchildren, the ones she had never met, the ones whose birthdays she had missed because she was too proud to call and too ashamed to admit she was wrong. Grace, 8 years old, opened the back door. She jumped out. She ran up the porch steps before Adeline could stop her. Grace did not believe in being stopped. And she stood in front of Colette and said, "Are you my grandma?" Colette's face broke. Not cracked. Broke. The wall she had built in 2009. The wall made of reputation and pride and, "What will people say?" came down in the space between a question and an answer, demolished by a child who had never been taught to be afraid of love. "Yes, baby," Colette said. Her voice shook. "I'm your grandma." Grace climbed into her lap. She fit perfectly. She fit the way grandchildren fit, as though the lap had been empty for exactly that shape, for exactly that weight, for exactly that long. Joseph got out of the truck. He positioned his crutches. He walked, slowly, carefully, the way he always walked, with the precision and patience that the town had mistaken for weakness, up the 3 porch steps. Colette watched him climb them. Each step was an effort. Each effort was a statement. He reached the top. He stood in front of the woman who had called him crippled and told her daughter he would ruin her life. He held out a praline, wrapped in wax paper, pecan and brown sugar and butter. "Mrs. Boussard," he said, "I brought you something sweet." Colette took the praline. She held it in both hands. She didn't eat it. She held it the way a person holds evidence, proof that the man she had dismissed was standing on her porch with supplies for her town and sweetness for her table and her granddaughter in her lap. "I'm sorry," Colette said. She said it to Joseph, not to Adeline, to Joseph, the person she had wronged the most, the person whose body she had judged from a porch she was now too frail to leave. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything." Joseph said, "Yes, ma'am, you were." He didn't soften it. He didn't add, "But it's okay," or "water under the bridge." He accepted the apology the way a man accepts something he earned, directly, completely, without pretending the wound hadn't happened. Then he said, "Now, what needs fixing?" Over the next 3 weeks, Joseph and Adeline coordinated the rebuilding of Jeanneret. Not alone. The community rallied. FEMA eventually arrived. The Red Cross set up a distribution center at the high school. But the Tates were the first. They were the ones who organized the volunteers. They were the ones who connected residents with insurance adjusters and FEMA caseworkers and contractors who wouldn't overcharge a desperate town. Joseph, the accountant, the numbers man, the man on crutches, set up a free financial assistance station in the parking lot of Thibodeau's Hardware. He helped 63 families file insurance claims. He helped 21 families apply for FEMA aid. He caught 4 contractor bids that were inflated by 40% or more and negotiated them down, saving those families a combined $87,000. Adeline ran the food and supply distribution from the church basement, the same church where Colette had poisoned the congregation against her. The women who had whispered about her now stood beside her, sorting cans and folding clothes. They didn't apologize. Most of them. One did. a woman named Marie, 60, who had been Colette's closest friend and most reliable amplifier. Marie said, "Adeline, I said things I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Adeline looked at her. She said, "Marie, I don't need your apology. I need you to carry that box to the truck." Marie carried the box. Sometimes forgiveness looks like delegation. Elijah worked beside his father. He carried files. He fetched crutches when they fell. He watched his father sit in a folding chair in a flooded parking lot and help strangers navigate the most complex paperwork of their lives. And he understood, in the way that 11-year-old boys understand things, through observation rather than explanation, that his father's disability was not a limitation. It was a lens. Joseph saw the world from a different angle, because the world had forced him to a different angle, and the different angle revealed things that the standard angle missed. The overcharged bid, the missing clause, the desperate family pretending they were fine when the numbers said they weren't. Grace distributed pralines. She walked through the shelter at the high school with a box of wax paper-wrapped pralines and handed them to every person she passed. She said, "My mama made these." To a woman crying in the corner, Grace said, "Don't cry. Have a praline. They fix everything." The woman laughed. It was the first laugh in the shelter that day. Grace was 8 years old, and she was fixing a town her grandmother had broken with a recipe her mother had learned from a grandmother whose name she'd never know. Some things travel through women like water through roots, underground, invisible, essential. Colette watched from the porch. She couldn't help. Her hips were bad. Her strength was gone. The woman who had once controlled the town's opinion could now barely control her own rocking chair. But she watched. She watched Adeline organize and Joseph calculate, and Elijah carry and Grace distribute, and she understood. Slowly, painfully, with the reluctance of a woman who has been wrong for 14 years and is only now willing to say it, that what she had called marrying poorly was the richest marriage she had ever seen. One evening, after the volunteers had gone home and the church basement was locked and the pralines were distributed, Adeline sat on the porch with Colette. The town was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Not peaceful, but exhausted. The quiet of a place that has been hit and is deciding whether to stand back up. Colette said, "Your father would have been proud of you." Roland had died in 2019. Heart attack. Same as every Broussard man. The mill, the stress, the body giving out before the mind. Adeline hadn't been told until a week after the funeral. Marcel had called, late, almost as an afterthought, and the afterthought had felt like a second death. Adeline said, "He never told me he wasn't." Colette's eyes filled. "He wasn't strong enough to fight me, Eddie. I know that. He wanted to call. He wanted to come see the babies, but I—" She stopped. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap, empty. "I was the one who kept him from you. I kept everyone from you, because I decided that being right was more important than being a mother. And I was wrong. And he died without meeting his grandchildren, and that is my fault, and I will carry it for the rest of my life." Adeline didn't say, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. It would never be okay. Roland had died without meeting Elijah and Grace, and that absence was a hole in the family's architecture that could never be filled. But Adeline took her mother's hand, the hand that had pressed flat on the kitchen table to deliver verdicts, the hand that had pointed at the door and said, "Don't come back," and she held it. "You're meeting them now, Mama. That's what matters now." Colette squeezed her daughter's hand. She said, "That man, Joseph, he climbed my porch steps on crutches and handed me a praline. I called him Crippled, and he brought me something sweet." She paused. "That's not a crippled man, Adeline. That's the strongest man I ever met." Today, Adeline Tate is 40 years old. She lives in Lake Charles with Joseph and Elijah and Grace. Tate Financial Services has 134 clients and 9 employees. The office on Broad Street still has pralines on the front desk. Grace insists on helping wrap them.
She is 10 now, and she has decided that pralines are her love language, and she is not wrong. Joseph is 43. He still uses crutches. He still designs his own furniture.
He still files taxes with the precision of a man who has spent his entire life finding the most efficient path through systems that weren't built for him. He told Adeline once in the kitchen while she was wrapping pralines and he was balancing on one crutch and stirring gumbo with his free hand, because Joseph Tate stirs gumbo one-handed the way he does everything, with total mastery of the available resources, he said, "You know, I'm glad she called me crippled." Adeline looked at him. "Why?" "Because it told me exactly who I was marrying into. And it told you exactly who you were choosing. And you chose me anyway. And every day since then, I've been trying to be worth the choice." Adeline set down the wax paper. She walked to her husband. She put her hands on his face, both hands, holding his jaw the way you hold something you decided to keep a long time ago and have never once considered setting down. She said, "Joseph Tate, you were worth the choice before you climbed those porch steps. You were worth the choice before you built this firm. You were worth the choice the day I watched you peel a crawfish with one hand and I thought, that man doesn't need the world to accommodate him. He's already figured it out. And I want to figure it out with him." Colette visits twice a year now. She rides with Elise, who drives from Jeanneret in a car she bought with money she saved from a job she got after the hurricane. A job at the rebuilt Bergeron's grocery, where Adeline used to bag groceries, where life has a way of rhyming whether you want it to or not. Colette sits at the kitchen table in Lake Charles and eats pralines, and holds Grace in her lap and watches Joseph work from his adjusted desk, and she says nothing about the crutches. Not because she has overcome her prejudice. Colette is 74, and the architecture of a lifetime is not demolished in 2 years. But because she has learned, in the way that old women learn things, slowly, reluctantly, with the specific humility that comes from watching a granddaughter choose a grandmother's lap without being told that the grandmother once tried to prevent her existence. She has learned that strength has nothing to do with how a man walks. It has to do with what he carries. And Joseph Tate, on 2 aluminum crutches with worn rubber grips, carries more than any man Colette has ever known. On the mantel in Adeline's living room, between a photograph of Elijah and Grace and a photograph of Joseph's adjusted desk, sits a single praline in a glass box. It is the first praline Adeline ever wrapped, 2012. Pecan and brown sugar and butter, wax paper, made in the kitchen of the Ryan Street house the week Joseph opened his firm. It is hard as a rock now. It is inedible, but it sits on the mantel the way a cornerstone sits in a building, not because anyone will ever eat it, but because it was the first thing they made, and first things deserve to be kept, and keeping them is how you remember where you started when the world wants you to forget. A woman married a man the town called Crippled, and the town told her she had ruined her life. 14 years later, she came back with a truck full of supplies and a husband who climbed a porch he'd been banished from and handed his mother-in-law a praline. That is not revenge. That is not vindication. That is something quieter and harder and more permanent than either. It is a woman and a man who were told they would fail, and who built a life so solid that when the storm came, they were the ones left standing. And the town that laughed? The town came to the door, and the door was open. Because Adeline Tate did not learn to love from a porch in Jeanneret. She learned it from a man who peeled crawfish with one hand and climbed stairs on 2 crutches, and never once asked the world to make itself easier. He just made himself stronger. And she stood beside him while he did it. That is marriage. That is the foundation, and everything built on top of it. The firm, the children, the pralines, the convoy, the porch steps climbed in front of a woman who said it couldn't be done. All of it stayed, because they built it to stay. And that's where we'll leave this story. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what lesson did you take from this? See you next time.